On the cold, sterile night of November 12, 2002, a 21-year-old nursing student named Grace Peterson vanished from inside Boston's prestigious St. Augustine's Children's Hospital. For 10 long years, her case was a ghost story whispered in the hospital's corridors, a painful mystery with no body, no witnesses, and no answers. The investigation went cold, leaving a family shattered by the deafening silence of the unknown. Then, a decade later, an unexpected discovery in a dusty supply closet changed everything. A child's simple crayon drawing, forgotten for years, would unravel a conspiracy of silence and betrayal, hidden in the one place meant to save lives. How is it possible that a secret so dark could remain buried for so long, right under everyone's noses? Before we reveal how that drawing exposed a horrifying truth, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Trust us, you won't want to miss the chain of events this single piece of paper set in motion. The initial hours after Grace failed to return home were a blur of confusion, not panic. Her coat and purse were found undisturbed in her volunteer locker on the pediatric oncology floor. Her car was still parked in the hospital garage. Hospital administration, protective of its reputation, treated the situation delicately, suggesting she might have left with a friend or simply gone home without telling anyone. But her parents knew their daughter. Grace was meticulous, responsible. She would never just disappear. By the next morning, their quiet concern had escalated into frantic desperation. When the Boston Police Department was finally called, the trail was already growing cold. The labyrinthine hospital, a place of healing, had become a crime scene, but its high walls and complex hierarchy seemed designed to keep secrets in, not let investigators see out. Grace Peterson was, by all accounts, a beacon of light in one of life's darkest places. A brilliant Boston College nursing student, she dedicated her free time to the children's cancer ward at St. Augustine's. She wasn't just a volunteer. She was a lifeline for families navigating unimaginable pain. She had a rare gift for connecting with the sickest children, inventing games and reading stories that offered a momentary escape from their reality of treatments and fear. Her dream was to join Doctors Without Borders, to take her compassion to the far corners of the world. She saw the good in people, especially within the hallowed halls of a hospital. It was this unwavering trust, this belief in the inherent goodness of an institution dedicated to healing, that would ultimately make her so vulnerable to the darkness hiding in plain sight. For the Peterson family, Grace's disappearance was not an event. It was the end of their world as they knew it. She was the emotional core of their tight-knit, middle-class household. Her father, a quiet man who worked in construction, and her mother, a schoolteacher, had built their lives around their two children. Her 15-year-old brother looked up to her as his guide and protector. In the aftermath of her vanishing, the silence in their home became a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. Her father quit his job, dedicating every waking moment to a search that consumed him, plastering her smiling face on every telephone pole and storefront in the city. Her mother retreated into a shell of grief so profound it became a permanent part of her. The uncertainty was a unique form of torture, a wound that could never scar over, because there was no closure. The last confirmed sighting of Grace was around 9 p.m. on that November night. A head nurse recalled seeing her cheerful demeanor after she finished reading a bedtime story to a 7-year-old patient. Grace mentioned she was heading down to the basement lab to help the hospital's most eminent researcher, Dr. Alistair Finch, with some urgent samples. This was not unusual. Grace was known for her eagerness to learn and assist. The final trace of her existence was captured on a grainy, low-resolution security camera. The footage showed her walking alongside the tall, charismatic doctor toward the staff-only service elevators. They were heading to a restricted area of the hospital, a place volunteers were not supposed to go. After that moment, the tape shows nothing. Grace Peterson, a young woman full of life and promise, simply ceased to exist. The initial police investigation was, to put it mildly, a catastrophic failure. Hampered by the hospital's tightly controlled access and a narrative managed by its legal team, detectives focused on the most convenient theories. They explored the possibility that she had run away, a theory her family vehemently rejected, or that she was abducted by a stranger after leaving the building. Dr. Alistair Finch was interviewed as a key witness, not a person of interest. His prestige was a shield. He calmly told investigators that Grace had assisted him for a few minutes in the lab, and he last saw her walking toward the staff exit. His alibi was solid, his reputation unassailable. The police never secured a warrant to thoroughly search the hospital's restricted sub-basements or his private research areas. He was a world-renowned doctor, and they were simply following the path of least resistance. Within weeks, the official investigation ground to a halt. Detectives, facing pressure from the hospital's powerful board and finding no signs of foul play, quietly reclassified Grace's case. It was no longer a high-priority missing person investigation, but was logged as a, quote, voluntary disappearance. This bureaucratic label was a profound insult to the Peterson family, a dismissal of everything they knew about their daughter. They felt abandoned by the very system meant to protect them. The police department, overwhelmed with other cases, moved on. The hospital, eager to distance itself from the tragedy, reinforced its security protocols and issued a carefully worded statement expressing sympathy. For the outside world, the story of the missing volunteer was fading, but for her family, the silence from the authorities was a second, more insidious kind of violence, the slow, crushing weight of institutional indifference. Grace's father, David Peterson, refused to let her be forgotten. He channeled his grief into a relentless, all-consuming quest for answers. Quitting his construction job, he transformed the family's living room into an investigation headquarters, its walls covered with maps, timelines, and photos of Grace's smiling face. His life became a painful routine, printing thousands of flyers, driving through every neighborhood in Boston, and showing her picture to anyone who would listen. He became a fixture in the city, a gaunt figure haunted by a single question: "Have you seen my daughter?" His search was a desperate act of faith against a wall of silence. While his wife retreated inward, David's pain was external, a public performance of a father's refusal to give up. But this obsession came at a cost, isolating him from his family and friends, who could only watch as he was consumed by a search that had no end. While David waged his public war for information, Grace's mother, Sarah, fought a silent, internal battle. The vibrant schoolteacher who once filled their home with laughter was gone, replaced by a ghost who moved through the rooms with a heavy, unbearable sadness. She kept Grace's bedroom exactly as it was on the day she vanished, a perfectly preserved shrine to a life interrupted. Each morning she would open the curtains, and each night she would close them, as if her daughter might still come home. The uncertainty was a poison that seeped into every aspect of her life, eroding her health and her spirit. The chasm between her and David grew wider with each passing day. His desperate, active search felt like a constant accusation against her paralyzing grief. Their shared loss, instead of bringing them together, had become a wedge that was slowly tearing their marriage apart. Caught in the crossfire of his parents, fractured grief was Grace's younger brother, Michael. At 15, he had not only lost his beloved older sister, but also the parents he once knew. He became the forgotten victim, a quiet observer of his family's disintegration. While his father chased shadows across the city and his mother disappeared into her sorrow, Michael was left to navigate the treacherous landscape of adolescence alone. He learned to be self-sufficient, to not ask for anything, to not add to the burden of his parents' pain. He grew up in a house where his sister's absence was the loudest presence, a constant reminder of what they had all lost. The trauma of her disappearance shaped him, leaving him with a deep-seated distrust of the world and a quiet anger that simmered just beneath the surface, a wound that never truly healed. Over the next few years, the Peterson family was subjected to the cruelest form of torture, the cycle of false hope. Every few months, a new lead would emerge, a flicker of light in the suffocating darkness. There was a supposed sighting from a truck driver in Ohio, which sent David on a frantic 1,000-mile journey that ended in bitter disappointment. Another time, an anonymous letter arrived, claiming to know what happened and demanding money in exchange for information. The police traced it to a local teenager, a cruel prank that shattered the family's fragile composure. Each dead end was another layer of scar tissue over an open wound. These hoaxes and mistaken identities were more than just distractions. They were emotional ambushes, reigniting their hope only to extinguish it more brutally each time, leaving them more depleted and heartbroken than before. As the years stretched on, public interest in Grace Peterson's disappearance waned. Her story, once a fixture in local news, was relegated to brief anniversary segments, a somber reminder of a mystery that had grown cold. The city of Boston, with its endless cycle of new tragedies and triumphs, moved on. The "Have you seen me?" posters, once fresh and urgent, became faded and tattered, blending into the urban landscape until they were invisible. For the Petersons, this fading public memory was a profound source of pain. It felt as if the world was conspiring to erase their daughter, to forget she ever existed. They were trapped in a time capsule of grief while everyone else continued with their lives. The case became a local legend, a ghost story whispered by hospital staff, but the vibrant, living person at its center was being lost to time. By 2012, a full decade after Grace vanished, the case was officially dormant. It was a thick, dusty file in the Boston Police Department's cold case unit, a collection of dead-end leads, unsubstantiated theories, and witness statements that led nowhere. For St. Augustine's Hospital, the incident was a footnote in its long history, a past tragedy that was best left undisturbed. David and Sarah Peterson had divorced, their shared grief having finally broken them. David still lived in the old house, a lonely sentinel guarding his daughter's memory, while Sarah had moved to a small apartment across town. Michael was an adult now, distant and scarred. The hope that had once fueled their search had dwindled to a faint, flickering ember. There were no more leads, no more calls, no more theories. There was only the gnawing, unending silence of the unknown. Then, in the fall of 2012, the silence was broken not by a confession or a new piece of forensic evidence, but by an act of routine housekeeping. A 22-year-old volunteer named Chloe, full of the same bright-eyed idealism Grace once had, was tasked with cleaning out a long-neglected art supply closet on the pediatric oncology floor. The closet was a time capsule, filled with dusty boxes of dried-up paints and faded construction paper. It smelled of antiseptic and old paper, a forgotten corner in a building dedicated to fighting for the future. As Chloe worked, she felt a sense of the history around her, the countless children who had passed through these halls. She had no idea she was about to unearth a ghost from the hospital's most painful chapter, a secret preserved by nothing more than a child's forgotten creation. Deep inside a cardboard box labeled Patient Artwork, 2002, Chloe found a tattered manila folder. Curious, she opened it. The folder was filled with crayon drawings, the kind of art that adorns refrigerators in homes across the country. There were pictures of smiling sons, stick-figure families, and beloved pets. They were innocent, heartbreaking artifacts of lives cut short. As she sifted through them, one drawing caught her eye. It was on yellowed paper, the crayon strokes heavy and deliberate, the way a small child presses down with all their might. In the bottom corner, in shaky block letters, was a name and a year. Leo, 2002. The image itself was simple, almost crude, yet it radiated a profound and unsettling energy that made Chloe's breath catch in her throat. Something about it was deeply, unnervingly wrong. The drawing depicted two figures. One was a girl with stringy brown hair and, most distinctly, a bright red scarf around her neck. She was being led by the hand by a much taller, stick-thin man in a white coat. His face was a blank circle, devoid of features. The girl's face, however, had a small, downturned mouth. They were walking away from a window with a smiling sun and toward a dark, descending staircase. At the bottom of the stairs was a door, and on that door was a single, ominous black cross. Above the faceless man in the white coat, the child had written two words in jagged, uneven letters: "The Bad Doctor." Chloe's blood ran cold. She had seen the memorial photos of Grace Peterson. The smiling volunteer in all the pictures wore a red scarf, a gift from her grandmother she never took off. A wave of nausea washed over Chloe. This wasn't just a child's fantasy, this was a narrative, a memory captured in wax and paper. The staircase, the door with the black cross, it was a child's interpretation of the path to the hospital's morgue, located in the sub-basement. Leo, the young artist, had not drawn a picture of Grace leaving the hospital. He had drawn a picture of her being taken down into the hospital's hidden depths by someone he perceived as a threat. For 10 years, everyone had been looking for an exit, a way Grace could have left the building. This drawing suggested the answer was never outside. It was buried deep within the institution itself. The child had been the only witness, and this drawing was his silent, terrified testimony, waiting a decade to be heard. Her hands trembling, Chloe knew she couldn't show this to an administrator. The hospital had covered things up once before. She had heard the whispers from the older nurses. She needed someone who remembered that time, someone who understood what this drawing truly meant. She found Brenda, a veteran nurse who had been working on the oncology floor since the late 90s. Brenda was a no-nonsense woman with kind eyes that had seen more grief than anyone should. Chloe pulled her into an empty room and, without a word, laid the drawing on the table. Brenda stared at it, her professional composure slowly dissolving. The color drained from her face, and she sank into a chair, her hand flying to her mouth. She didn't just see a drawing. She saw a memory she had long tried to suppress. Brenda's voice was a hoarse whisper when she finally spoke. "Dr. Finch," she said, her eyes fixed on the tall, faceless figure. That's who the children called him when they thought no one was listening. She explained that Dr. Alistair Finch, the eminent researcher, had a private, unofficial research lab in the sub-basement, a place no one was allowed to enter. It was near a network of old, little-used service tunnels that connected directly to the morgue. This was the piece of the puzzle that had never fit. The police had accepted Finch's story that he last saw Grace near a staff exit on the ground floor. But Leo's drawing depicted a descent, a journey downward, into the very part of the hospital Finch had claimed as his private domain, a place shielded from scrutiny and institutional oversight. The drawing had given a location to a decade of shapeless grief. It wasn't a random abduction. It wasn't a voluntary disappearance. It was something that happened right here, under their feet. Brenda looked at Chloe, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. The institutional silence that had protected the hospital's reputation for 10 years suddenly felt like a betrayal of Grace, of the children, and of her own conscience. She knew what they had to do. The drawing was more than a clue. It was a voice from the past, demanding to be heard. That afternoon, the two women, one a veteran of the hospital's history and the other a newcomer, walked out of St. Augustine's and drove to the Boston Police Department. They carried with them the simple crayon drawing that would finally force a reckoning with the secrets buried in the hospital's foundations. When Chloe and Brenda presented the drawing at the Boston Police Department, it was met with a weary skepticism that often greets decade-old evidence in a cold case. To most of the veteran officers, a child's drawing was flimsy, interpretive, and far from the concrete proof needed to reopen such a high-profile, sensitive investigation. But for Detective Miles Corbin, a younger officer who had only read about the Grace Peterson case in the academy, it was a spark in the dark. He wasn't burdened by the institutional memory of the failed first investigation. He saw what the others missed: the specificity of the red scarf, the nurse's corroboration of Finch's private lab, and the chillingly simple label, the bad doctor. He convinced his superiors to let him conduct a preliminary, off-the-books review. He knew that if this was real, he couldn't afford to alert the hospital. The hunt for Grace Peterson was no longer about a missing person. It was now a quiet, internal search for a killer. Corbin began by pulling the original case files, boxes of paper that smelled of dust and resignation. He spent days poring over every witness statement, every dead-end lead. He focused on Dr. Alistair Finch. The initial interview notes portrayed him as a cooperative, if somewhat arrogant witness who was quickly cleared. But Corbin saw something else: An interview that was cut short, with no follow-up questions about his restricted lab. Cross-referencing hospital records, he unearthed a maintenance log from November 13, 2002, the day after Grace vanished. It detailed an emergency electrical and masonry repair in the sub-basement, requested by Finch's research department. The notes mentioned a damaged wall section near a service conduit. At the time, it was a meaningless detail. But now, filtered through the lens of Leo's drawing, it felt like a deliberate act of concealment, a carefully constructed piece of a 10-year-old crime scene. The investigation now had a clear target. Corbin discovered that Dr. Finch had taken an unexpectedly early retirement in 2008, citing, quote, personal health reasons, and was now living a quiet, secluded life in a wealthy coastal town north of Boston. Digging deeper, Corbin found another piece of the puzzle. Robert Davies, the hospital's CEO in 2002, had also retired just a year after Finch, and the head of security, a former police captain named Frank Miller, had been dismissed during a, quote, departmental restructuring around the same time. The simultaneous departure of three key figures who would have been central to any internal crisis was too neat, too coordinated to be a coincidence. It wasn't just one man with a secret. It was starting to look like a calculated exodus, an institutional effort to bury a shared, terrible truth by simply walking away from it. Corbin knew he had to find the child who drew the picture. His heart sank when he learned that Leo, the young artist, had succumbed to his cancer in early 2003, just months after Grace's disappearance. The only direct witness was gone. However, Corbin located Leo's parents. In a quiet, heartbreaking interview, they confirmed their son's deep fear of Dr. Finch, which they had dismissed as a child's anxiety about his treatments. They recalled Leo talking about a secret room in the basement where the doctor took children for special medicine, a place he said was cold and had no windows. Leo had told his parents that Grace was the only one who believed him when he said the medicine made him feel worse. He said she promised to talk to the bad doctor for him. Leo's drawing wasn't just a picture. It was his last attempt to tell the story Grace could no longer tell. Armed with the drawing, the maintenance log, and the parents' testimony, Detective Corbin now had enough to secure a search warrant. He presented his case to a judge, who granted full access to the sub-basement levels of St. Augustine's Hospital. The current administration, years removed from the original leadership, was horrified and offered their complete cooperation. Corbin and his team descended into the hospital's underbelly, a maze of pipes and concrete corridors. They found Finch's old lab, now a dusty storage area. It appeared untouched. But, using the old maintenance records as a map, they located the exact wall section from the 2002 repair order. It was painted a slightly different shade of gray, a subtle scar on the face of the old building. When an officer tapped it with a hammer, the sound that came back was not the solid thud of concrete, but the hollow echo of a hidden space. The team broke through the wall. Behind it was a small, crudely constructed, soundproofed room. The air that escaped was stale, heavy with the scent of chemicals and decay. And inside, wrapped in hospital-grade plastic sheeting, were the skeletal remains of a young woman. A faded red scarf was still loosely tied around the neck. After 10 years of agonizing uncertainty, Grace Peterson had been found. But the discovery that would blow the case wide open lay in a lead-lined box in the corner of the hidden room. Inside was a hard drive. Forensic specialists worked for days to break the encryption, and when they did, they uncovered the horrifying motive for Grace's murder. The drive contained meticulous, unsanctioned records of illegal clinical trials, proving that Dr. Finch had been using his terminally ill pediatric patients as unwitting subjects for an experimental cancer drug, sponsored by a powerful pharmaceutical corporation. The data on the hard drive was the final, devastating key. It laid bare a conspiracy of breathtaking cruelty. The record showed that the experimental drug was causing severe, undocumented side effects, and Finch was falsifying the data to show positive results, driven by millions in secret funding. Encrypted emails between Finch and former CEO Robert Davies confirmed that Grace, with her sharp mind and access to patient charts, had discovered the discrepancies. She had noticed that the children in Finch's special program were deteriorating faster than their charts indicated. The emails revealed her final confrontation with Finch and Davies's cold, calculated decision to, quote, contain the problem. The head of security, Frank Miller, was brought in to erase the security footage of Grace being led to the sub-basement. Her murder wasn't a crime of passion. It was a corporate execution designed to protect profits, reputations, and a secret that was killing children. The arrests were swift, coordinated, and happened simultaneously in 3 different quiet, affluent neighborhoods. In the early morning hours, teams of state police descended on the lives the conspirators had built on a foundation of lies. Dr. Alistair Finch was taken from his waterfront home, a place of serene beauty that stood in stark contrast to the ugliness of his past. Former CEO Robert Davies was interrupted during his morning coffee on the patio of his golf course-adjacent condo, his carefully curated retirement shattered. And Frank Miller, the former head of security, was apprehended while walking his dog, his face a mask of disbelief as the handcuffs closed around his wrists. For 10 years, they had lived with their secret, protected by time and institutional silence. But that morning, the ghost of Grace Peterson had finally come for them, and their carefully constructed worlds came crashing down in a matter of minutes. In the sterile environment of an interrogation room, the conspiracy began to unravel. Frank Miller, the ex-cop, was the first to break. He understood the game better than the others. He knew the weight of the evidence they must have. Detective Corbin didn't need to press hard. He simply laid out the facts. The maintenance logs, the testimony from Leo's parents, the emails from the recovered hard drive. Miller, facing a lifetime in prison for a murder he didn't commit, chose self-preservation. His loyalty had always been transactional. He admitted to his role with a weary resignation, detailing how Davies had called him that night, in a panic. Miller described how he personally wiped the security server, erasing the crucial minutes of footage showing Finch leading Grace into the sub-basement. He was the fixer, the man who made the problem disappear from the official record. He gave them Davies and Finch in exchange for a deal. Robert Davies, the former CEO, presented a different challenge. He was a master of corporate spin, and even in an orange jumpsuit, he tried to control the narrative. He portrayed himself not as a conspirator, but as a leader, making a difficult choice to prevent a catastrophic scandal from destroying a beloved institution. He claimed Finch had told him Grace's death was a tragic accident, and that he had acted to protect the hospital's life-saving work from the ensuing media frenzy. He spoke of donor relationships and public trust, framing the cover-up as a painful but necessary act of institutional triage. But the emails from the hard drive told a different story. They showed Davies was aware of the illegal trials long before Grace's death and was complicit in the fraud. His calculated attempt to minimize his role only highlighted the cold, inhuman calculus that had doomed Grace Peterson from the moment she asked the right questions. The final confrontation was with Dr. Alistair Finch. For hours he sat in absolute silence, a portrait of intellectual arrogance. He deflected every question with disdain, treating Detective Corbin as a lesser mind incapable of understanding the complexities of his work. The data from the hard drive, the testimony from Miller and Davies, none of it moved him. Then, Corbin slid a laminated copy of Leo's drawing across the table. He said nothing, letting the crude crayon image speak for itself. Finch stared at it, his composure finally cracking. It wasn't the depiction of Grace or the red scarf that broke him. It was the 2 words scrawled above his featureless face. The bad doctor. This simple, childish judgment, a verdict delivered from the grave by one of his victims, succeeded where all other evidence had failed. It pierced his shield of narcissism and reduced him from a genius to a monster in a child's drawing. The confession, when it came, was not a torrent of remorse but a chillingly precise lecture. Finch began to speak, his voice devoid of emotion, as if describing a failed experiment. He recounted how Grace, with her quiet intelligence, had approached him that night. She hadn't been accusatory. She had been clinical. She laid out her notes on a lab table, showing him the discrepancies between the official patient charts and the notes she took while comforting the children. She had discovered the pattern of accelerated organ failure in his special program. She knew he was poisoning them. She didn't understand the science, he sneered, but she understood the results. She told him she had a moral obligation to report her findings to the hospital's ethics committee. In that moment, her idealism became a direct threat to his entire life's work, his legacy. The final moments of Grace's life, as told by Finch, were brutal and swift. Their argument escalated in the soundproofed lab. She was resolute, unintimidated by his towering reputation. She told him his work wasn't a greater good. It was a betrayal of his oath. When she turned to leave, he grabbed a heavy metal canister from a workbench and struck her from behind. It was a single, panicked blow. As she lay dying on the cold concrete floor, he didn't call for help. Instead, he called Robert Davies. The plan was hatched within an hour. Miller would handle the cameras. The next morning, Finch himself submitted the maintenance request for the wall, citing a, quote, biohazard containment breach. He supervised the work himself, ensuring his secret was sealed behind a layer of concrete and drywall. Grace Peterson was erased, and the experiments on the children continued for another 6 years. In his final, horrifying monologue, Dr. Finch laid bare the full extent of his depravity. He felt no guilt. To him, the children were already lost causes, their lives tragic but finite. He believed he was salvaging a purpose from their deaths, using their bodies to perfect a drug that could one day save millions. He saw himself as a pioneer, operating in a morally gray area that lesser minds couldn't comprehend. Grace, in his view, was not a hero. She was an obstacle, a sentimental fool who couldn't see the bigger picture. His confession was not an act of contrition, but a final, defiant assertion of his own twisted logic. The truth of what happened in the sub-basement of St. Augustine's was finally revealed, not as a simple murder, but as a symptom of a profound and terrifying darkness, hiding behind a white coat and the promise of a cure. The trials of Dr. Alistair Finch, Robert Davies, and Frank Miller became a media spectacle, a grim public dissection of institutional betrayal. The courtroom was a theater of raw emotion, packed every day with the families of the children Finch had experimented on, their faces a mixture of grief and rage. Finch remained a chillingly detached figure throughout the proceedings, viewing the trial as an intellectual inconvenience rather than a moral reckoning. He was swiftly found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Davies and Miller, facing overwhelming evidence of their conspiracy and obstruction of justice, received sentences of 15 to 20 years. The verdicts brought a sense of legal finality, but for the families in the gallery, the justice felt hollow, a cold comfort in the face of such profound and calculated cruelty. For David and Sarah Peterson, sitting side by side in the front row, the trial was a final, brutal pilgrimage. Hearing Finch's clinical description of their daughter's last moments was an agony beyond words. The truth didn't heal the chasm between them, but it did build a fragile bridge of shared understanding across it. The years of blaming themselves and each other for not doing more finally gave way to the stark reality of the forces they were up against. After the verdict, they didn't embrace. They simply sat in the silent courtroom, two strangers bound by an unbearable loss, as the weight of 10 years of not knowing was replaced by the crushing certainty of what had been done. The torture of ambiguity was over, but the pain of the truth was just beginning to settle in, a permanent resident in their shattered lives. The revelations had a profound impact on Michael Peterson. Now in his late 20s, he had spent half his life defined by a ghost. The truth finally gave a name and a face to the abstract tragedy that had stolen his sister and broken his family. For the first time, he saw his parents not as the distant, grieving figures who had abandoned him in his youth, but as victims of a monstrous conspiracy. He began visiting them separately, listening to their stories, and slowly piecing together the family he barely remembered. The anger he had carried for so long began to soften into a deep, sorrowful empathy. The end of the mystery was the beginning of his own healing, a chance to reclaim his identity from the shadow of his sister's absence and reconnect with the parents he had lost long ago. The fallout for St. Augustine's Children's Hospital was catastrophic. The scandal ripped through the institution, shattering its century-old reputation and exposing a culture of arrogance and secrecy. Donations plummeted, and the hospital faced a barrage of lawsuits from the families of the children in Finch's illegal trials. The entire board of directors was forced to resign, and a new administration was brought in with a mandate for radical transparency. The hospital became a national symbol of medical ethics gone wrong. In a public press conference, the new CEO issued a gut-wrenching apology, not just to the Peterson family, but to every family who had trusted them with their child's life. The hospital's path back to public trust would be long and arduous, a painful but necessary penance for the secrets it had kept buried for so long. Out of the ashes of their tragedy, the Peterson family found a new purpose. Using the substantial settlement from their civil lawsuit against the hospital and the pharmaceutical company, they established the Grace Peterson Foundation. Its mission was simple but powerful: to protect patients and demand accountability in medical research. The foundation championed legislation requiring stricter oversight of clinical trials and created a secure, anonymous hotline for medical whistleblowers. Grace's name, once a symbol of a heartbreaking mystery, was transformed into a beacon of integrity and patient advocacy. Her parents and brother, now working together, channeled their grief into a force for change, ensuring that her death would not be in vain. Her legacy was no longer about how she died, but about the lives she would continue to protect. A year after the trial, a small, quiet memorial garden was dedicated on the grounds of St. Augustine's. David, Sarah, and Michael stood together as a simple bronze plaque was unveiled. It read, "In memory of Grace Peterson. Her search for truth lights the way for others." The garden was a place of peace, a stark contrast to the dark basement where her life had ended. The truth had not brought her back, nor had it erased the scars left on her family, but it had brought an end to the silence. It had brought accountability. And in a way, it had brought Grace home, her story no longer a whispered ghost tale, but a powerful, enduring testament to the courage of one young woman who dared to question a man who believed he was above the rules. If you believe that no victim should be forgotten and that the search for truth is essential, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth investigations into cases that need to be told. Thank you for listening. The story of Grace Peterson is a chilling reminder that the most profound evil often wears a mask of respectability. It's a story that forced an entire city, and the medical community at large, to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth: that the institutions we trust with our lives are fallible, run by human beings capable of both incredible good and unimaginable cruelty. The St. Augustine scandal did not just lead to 3 convictions. It sparked a national reckoning. Her case is now a permanent fixture in the curriculum of medical and nursing schools across the country, a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of unchecked power and the corrupting influence of money and ambition. The illusion that a hospital's walls provide absolute sanctuary was shattered, leaving behind a more complex and ultimately more honest understanding of the systems we depend on. Grace's legacy, however, is not one of victimhood. It is one of enduring strength. The Grace Peterson Foundation, managed by her family, has become a formidable force in patient advocacy. It's not just a name on a letterhead. It is an active, vocal, and relentless champion for the vulnerable. The foundation was instrumental in passing new federal legislation, dubbed Grace's Law, that mandates stricter, independent oversight for all private clinical trials involving minors. Her parents and brother, once torn apart by the agony of not knowing, found a shared path forward in this work. They channeled their immeasurable loss into a mission, ensuring that Grace's unwavering sense of justice would continue to protect countless others. In a way, her dream of helping people was realized, not in distant lands, but in the very fabric of the system that failed her. It is also crucial to remember the other victims of Dr. Finch's monstrous ambition, the children. For years, their families mourned them as victims of a terrible disease, never suspecting the truth was far more sinister. The trial brought them a new, agonizing layer of grief, revealing that their children's final months were not just a battle against cancer, but a silent suffering at the hands of a trusted doctor. The foundation established a special memorial fund in their names, providing financial and emotional support to other families navigating the brutal landscape of pediatric cancer. It was an act of reclamation, a way to ensure these children would be remembered not as data points in a fraudulent study, but as the bright, beloved souls they were, their short lives honored by an act of collective compassion. Today, if you walk through the grounds of St. Augustine's, you will find a small, quiet garden tucked away from the main entrance. It's a place of calm reflection, planted with white roses and forget-me-nots. In the center stands a simple bronze plaque, its words catching the afternoon sun. It doesn't recount the horror or the conspiracy. It simply reads, "In memory of Grace Peterson, her search for truth lights the way for others." Her parents still visit, often sitting on the bench in a comfortable silence that speaks more than words ever could. Her brother Michael now brings his own young daughter, telling her stories not of a tragedy, but of a brave aunt who stood up for what was right. The story did not end in that dark basement. It continues here, in the quiet, stubborn persistence of love and memory. The truth, when it finally emerged, did not offer simple closure. It did not erase the pain or bring Grace back. But it did something just as powerful. It brought accountability. It affirmed that a single voice, even one silenced for a decade, can ultimately dismantle a fortress of lies. It reminds us that courage isn't always a loud, heroic act. Sometimes, it's the quiet resolve of a young volunteer asking a difficult question, or the simple honesty of a child's drawing. The search for justice is a long and often lonely road, but as Grace's story proves, it is a journey that must always be taken, because no life should ever be forgotten, and no truth should remain buried forever. If you believe that no victim should be forgotten and that the search for truth is essential, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth investigations into cases that need to be told. Thank you for listening.